great pleasure and honour to be here today. I'm here to give you a talk today which is a little bit different to Professor Sergio Penna's talk yesterday. It's a shame that we couldn't have a debate over some of these issues. A year or so ago, scientists in the United States genetically engineered a mouse which can run up to 6 hours at a speed of 20 metres per minute before needing a rest. A normal mouse can run several minutes at that speed. They made this mouse by changing one gene in the cycle which metabolises or uses sugar in the body. And we have a very similar cycle in our body. And this prevents the muscle cramping effects of the build-up of lactic acid. The researchers were creating this mouse to study the effects of diet and exercise on longevity and cancer risk, and to understand the genetic basis of inherited conditions which lead to muscle wasting. So for medical purposes, not to create super mice. But now I'm going to show you a picture of a super mouse and compared to a normal mouse. Now at the back is the normal mouse and on the front is the super mouse, the genetically modified mouse. Now initially they both fall off the treadmill. In fact, there goes super mouse off the treadmill. But after 200 metres, the normal mouse collapses from exhaustion. He doesn't get back on the treadmill. That's 200 metres. But super mouse keeps going on for 6,000 metres. It's quite a significant difference. And indeed, kept going on for 5 hours at that speed. So he was 7 times more active. He could run 6 kilometres instead of 200 metres. He ate 60% more, but had half the body weight and only 10% of the body fat. He lived much longer and looked much healthier and was able to reproduce to the equivalent of a human age of 80 years. And also had lower cholesterol levels. Now we could create a superhuman today with exactly the same genetic engineering change. If we did this in a human embryo, we may well create a human being that could run the marathon in under 1.5 hours. We have created a large number of animals which have vastly enhanced capabilities. So this scepticism that you heard yesterday about the possibility of changing human beings or behaviour is not supported by animal evidence, because we've been able to create mice, the Doogie mouse, who has better memory. We have mice with colour vision, where normally mice see only black and white. We have mice which live much longer. We have voles, which are like rats, who instead of being polygamous, having multiple female partners, are monogamous by genetic engineering. We have Schwarzenegger mice with huge muscles. We have monkeys which work much harder than normal. We have mice resistant to cancer and obesity, and mice which run marathons. This is just a selection of my favourite genetically engineered animals. We've been genetically engineering animals for 20 years, and half of the US National Institutes of Health budget goes to creating genetically engineered animals to mimic human diseases. But we're starting to understand the contribution of our biology to our abilities, like our ability to run or to reproduce. The creation of super mouse and other animals like it represents a major step towards biological liberation. That is, being liberated from the biological constraints, the genetic constraints and other biological constraints that evolution places on us. Until now, until this century, we've been stuck with the biology that evolution has given us. And the reason that there are no supermen, like the reason there are no naturally evolving super mice, is that it would have been disadvantageous through our evolutionary history. The super mouse had to eat twice as much, so he would have had to find twice as much food to run that kind of metabolism. And our biochemistry is set to Stone Age conditions, Pleistocene conditions, a few 100,000 years ago. But today, of course, we have lots of food in most countries in the developed world. Our problem is many cases, particularly there too much food and obesity. Whereas evolution may have had good reasons not to produce supermen we could. So our lives, when we sexual partners we have, whether we get cancer or heart disease, how long we live, how fast we can run, how smart we are, whether we're aggressive, whether we're introverted, extroverted, erotic, all of these things are in very large part determined by our biology. And the differences between us are often the function of very small changes in our biology. We now have the possibility of creating humans who are twice as fast, who live twice as long, who can reproduce at the age of 80, not aging, who are mentally and physically much quicker. This is not science fiction. This century may well see these kinds of changes in human beings. So if you didn't think that was enough to encourage you that biology holds the chance of changing human beings significantly, I'm now going to talk about more radical changes. I've talked about genetic engineering, genetic modification, but we could also transfer new genes from one species into another, into humans, or fuse humans with other kinds of life forms. So on the left-hand side you see alba. This is a fluorescent rabbit, a rabbit which glows in the dark. It's a real animal. It was created by French scientists for an artist called Eduardo Katz. It was created by transferring the gene from a jellyfish into the rabbit. And the rabbit is healthy. The gene expresses the protein which enables it to fluoresce. This is proof that you can transfer the gene from one species to another safely, effectively, and efficiently. On the right-hand side is an embryo which is fluorescent. But this is not a rabbit embryo, this is a human embryo created last year in exactly the same way by transferring a gene from a jellyfish into a human embryo. The embryo was destroyed in America, but if you allow that embryo to grow up, it would be a fluorescent human being in exactly the same way as alba is a fluorescent rabbit. So any gene which occurs in the animal and plant kingdom is capable of being transferred into humans to confer that ability or that quality. So plants can metabolize sunlight with chlorophyll. We could create human beings that can metabolize sunlight. We no longer have the need to eat. Now this technique is used for very reasonable purposes in medical research to create disease models, to create species of animals resistant or plants resistant to disease, to create products which are useful for humans. We've introduced human blood clotting factors that are necessary for haemophiliacs into goats, and the goats secrete the human factor in their milk. And we're attempting to modify animal organs to transfer to humans. Even more radical than the transfer of genes or combinations of genes is creating new life forms that have never existed. We can create animal, human, or human-animal chimeras. Human chimeras naturally exist when two embryos fuse during development. And sometimes you can have a male embryo which fuses with a female embryo to create a hermaphrodite. Animal chimeras have been the object of fascination. This is Pegasus, a chimera between a horse and a bird. This is the Sphinx, a cross between a human and a lion, in this case a leopard. Another Sphinx, another Sphinx. This, however, is a real animal, a beefalo. This is a cross between a buffalo and a cow by using sperm from one species introduced into the other species. This is crossbreeding, which has been used by humans for quite some time. It's a cross between a beefalo and a bison. This is a jag lion, a cross between a jaguar and a lion. This is a leopon, a cross between a lion and a leopard. A liger. These are not inventions. This is not. I can't use what's that thing in Adobe, whatever that program, Photoshop. This is not Photoshop. This is real. This is a liger, cross between a lion and a tiger. Now this one, although not so beautiful, is much more scientifically interesting because this is a geek, a cross between a goat and a sheep, not created by fusing a sperm and an egg, but by fusing the embryo from a goat and a sheep. Another geek, baby geek, smaller baby geek. These are live-born, novel species we create using our scientific technology. The technology which is being used in the UK to mix human and animal genetic material to create embryonic stem cells, to create organs for transplantation or for research purposes could also be used to create human chimp chimeras. And what was science fiction in the 1960s is not science fiction today. Doug Melton, one of the world's most famous stem cell scientists in Harvard, told me that with $6 million US, he could create a live-born human chimp chimera. You could study language development, use such a being for various scientific purposes. It's not being done, but it's possible. So this skepticism about radical biological change to the human condition that we heard yesterday, I think is mistaken. I think this century will see a change in biology and medicine to not just focusing on the treatment and prevention of disease, but into understanding and modifying the human condition, the title of this conference, through biological modification, through biology, to make us happier and better people, what I call biological liberation. There's some book yesterday that was mentioned. We're already trying to do this with pharmaceuticals and surgery, cosmetic surgery, in sport. I'll talk this afternoon. We're improving our cognitive performance. The US military, we heard a lot about yesterday, is using modafinil and Ritalin to improve the cognitive performance of its pilots. We enhance our mood when we use our drugs like alcohol, or I think Brazil, cocaine, or marijuana, or whatever recreational drugs people take. And in the bedroom, people use Viagra to improve their performance. I'm not so interested in these minor modifications of the human condition. I'm more interested in the fundamental changes. Now, we could radically prolong human life through biology by understanding aging. Jellyfish has been discovered, which regenerates itself. And there are animal models that live twice as long as normal. Francis Collins, who headed the Human Genome Project at the Davos World Economic Forum when I was giving a seminar on radical life extension, responded to my question, is it possible to indefinitely prolong human life? He said yes, there are no biological barriers. But I'm not interested in human beings living 200 years or 1,000 years, which we debate the ethics of. I'm interested in how our lives go, in the quality of our life. Now again, you heard a lot of skepticism yesterday about the capacity for genetics to influence our condition. I'm less skeptical. A walk through the park can give you some evidence of the power of genetics. All of you are familiar with the differences between the 300 different breeds of dogs. Some dogs are vicious, some are plastic, some are stupid, some are smart, some are lazy, some are hardworking, some are beautiful, some are ugly, some are big, some are small. These differences are all genetic. They're the result of selective breeding over 10,000 years from a small group of wolves and canines. Now, it's true that we can disable a Doberman by smashing it over the head or depriving it of food, but given normal conditions, a Doberman will always beat the Chihuahua in a fight. This is the power of genetics and biology. So we are coming to understand the contribution of biology and in particular genetics, but not only genetics, epigenetics and other factors, and their influence on how we live. I mentioned the example of a group of monkeys who have been genetically engineered to work harder by transferring material from the brains of one group to another, and the engineering of monogamy involves. The neuroscience, which is seeking to treat and prevent disease, can also be used to enhance the human condition. In one study, environmental stimulation, the drug Prozac and nerve growth factors all delayed the onset of a genetic condition, Huntington's disease. And those same factors could also be used to enhance mental performance in normal people. Here's a baby inside the womb. His head is tightly packed inside the pelvis. Here is the increase in cranial size through human evolution. We now have roughly the largest brains which we could fit into the female pelvis and deliver by childbirth, and which we could run with the amount of sugar and other resources that we could find. The brain uses a lot of energy. But of course, today we could use our understanding of neuroscience or genetics to administer nerve growth factors or to genetically change the expression of genes that could enhance the development of the early human brain. Behavioural genetics is a field of genetics which is in its infancy, which seeks to understand the contribution of genes not to diseases, but to psychological types, personality traits, intelligence, behaviour, and so on. It seeks to understand the basis of aggression, alcoholism, personality disorders, homosexuality, maternal behaviour, intelligence, and so on. All measurable aspects of human personality have a genetic component. This is not to say that they are genetic, but that genes influence the differences between us, the differences in the kinds of people that we are. Just looking around the room, some of you have got hair, some of you are bald, some of you are tall, some of you are short, some of you are larger, some of you are smaller. That's in part genetic. Of course, you can modify it with the environment. But all of the major personality types, conscientiousness, neuroticism, extroversion, agreeableness, openness to experience, have a significant genetic component. Now, it's true, as we heard yesterday, that many genes may be involved in these personalities. But our biology influences the sorts of people we are. Indeed, even single genes may significantly affect some personality features, such as novelty seeking or anxiety. And genetics plays a role in just our mood, how happy we tend to be on average. In fact, genetics plays more of a role in how happy, in our subjective level of well-being, than does our environment. Now, we can improve the human condition in various ways. By mating, we've sought to select partners who are genetically superior, often at a subconscious level. By genetic diagnosis of the fetus and aborting fetuses who have diseases, but you could apply this to other conditions. And by using genetic diagnosis of multiple embryos. And we could also manipulate existing human beings by pharmacology, which we've sought to do through drugs like Ritalin or modafinil, or by genetic or other biological interventions. Now, I embrace this vision of the future. I think we should be happy people, not just healthy people. Now, I'm going to go through some definitions yesterday after the talk I heard. And it's true that human nature is a highly contested term, with some people even disputing its existence. And there has been much debate about the limits of intervening in basic human nature. The famous German philosopher Jürgen Habermas turned his gaze to bioethics and wrote this book, The Future of Human Nature, in which he was very scathing of attempts to change human nature. Well, I'm going to disagree with these bioconservatives and argue that not only should we be allowed to enhance human nature, we should indeed be under an obligation to do so. So I'll stipulate a definition of human nature as our nature as organisms or animals, the kind of being each of us is. Now, there's no single nature, but many aspects of our individual nature are shared by all other human beings, and in some cases all. So there's a general human nature, the tendency of human beings to behave in certain ways. So, for example, telekinesis, the ability to read other people's minds, are not properties of human nature. They may be properties of other beings, but they're not part of human nature. The capacity to understand other people's emotions is typically part of human nature. But we can also talk about individual nature. Our nature as individual humans and their differences, and that's what I want to concentrate on today. So according to the view I have of human nature is the disposition of an individual human to think, believe, feel, behave and be in certain characteristic ways in a given set of environmental and social circumstances. So, when humans are confronted with a wild animal, they tend to run away. That's a part of human nature. They don't tend to engage in a fight with a ferocious lion. Now, these dispositions are, it's true, grounded in many different causes. Our biology, our psychology, our social experience. But I want to focus today on the biological contribution to our nature. And I want to ask the question, can we enhance human nature? Now, enhancement is a very wide concept, again, which I need to define. It broadly means to increase or improve something. So a doctor may enhance his patient's chance of survival by giving the patient a drug. And we may enhance the functioning of a person's immune system or memory. These are functionalist accounts of enhancement that says that the enhancement is the enhancement of a certain kind of function of a human being. But we need to distinguish this functional enhancement from human enhancement. Because enhancing a permanently unconscious person's chance of survival might not be a good for the person. It might not constitute human enhancement. Even though the person has an enhanced chance of survival, it may not be an enhancement of the human. It might not enhance the intrinsic good. So, for example, I mentioned the doogie mice that have better memory. They're also more susceptible to pain. So although their memory has been enhanced, it's not clear that their overall well-being has been enhanced, whether this is mouse enhancement. So when we're considering human enhancement, we're really considering from the ethical perspective a whole person's life, not mere functioning. The improvement is some change in a state of the person, biological or psychological, which is good, which tends to increase the person's well-being. So in a book which is forthcoming, I give what I call a welfarist definition of human enhancement. Human enhancement is any change in our biology or psychology which increases the chances of a person leading a good life in circumstances, in a given set of social and environmental circumstances. We can define related concepts. I define a capability as any state of the person's biology or psychology which increases the chance of a person leading a good life, and a disability as any state of the person's biology or psychology which decreases the chances of a good life. Now, in terms of reproduction, in terms of having babies, bringing children into the world, I've argued that there are three principles that regulate this. Procreative or reproductive liberty or freedom, a term which I've introduced or created, procreative beneficence, which I'll describe, and also the public interest. So procreative beneficence is a term which I've used to replace eugenics. It's the idea that couples should select a child of the possible children they could have who is expected to have the best life, or at least a life as good as others, based on the relevant available information. So this is the idea of Gattaca, that we should select that child who we expect not to have anxiety, neurosis, or features which we think detract from a good life. I think Gattaca is a very bad film, but not for the reasons articulated yesterday, and I will say why I think it's a bad film. Now, expected to have the good life, of course, does not mean will, and Gattaca plays on this distinction. Those with the greatest gifts may squander them, and those with very significant disabilities may have very good lives. We heard Mozart overcame his disability with Tourette's syndrome to produce great music. Beethoven produced a symphony while he was deaf, etc. This is true. Of course, people can achieve things with significant disabilities. That's not the point. The point is, what do you expect in advance of knowing what will happen? Would you choose to be deaf or to have Tourette's syndrome? Or do you think these diseases will make your life more difficult? It's clear they will make your life more difficult. Now, there is a familiar moral theory and theory of rationality called decision-theoretic consequentialism, which says that it's a feature of rationality that we should choose the course of action which has the greatest expected value. So when you choose a television set, you choose that television set which is best value for money. That means that given the amount of money that you have to spend, it has the best picture, largest screen, the best sound, and so on. That's what you do every day. When you choose to have a cup of coffee, you choose the kind of cup of coffee that maximises the expected value for you. So you might like sugar, so you put 2 teaspoons of sugar. This is just a principle of human rationality. Procreative beneficence and enhancement are derived from basic principles of rationality like this. So to give you an example, when you're considering whether to have a knee replacement for arthritis, you weigh the pros and cons. How good or bad these are, and how likely they are. Probability and the magnitude of their value. How bad is the pain and disability that you currently have? How bad will it be after the operation? What are the side effects? How likely is the operation? And so on. It's a familiar way of thinking. I'm not introducing any complex concept of continental philosophy. This is just how we live our lives. I'm from Australia. I'm a very simple guy. I can't understand these complicated concepts, but I can understand what it is to choose one thing which is better than another. Moral responsibility is a function of the foreseeability of the consequences and how avoidable they are. So how much can you see what the consequences of your action are, and how much can you choose to do otherwise? If you can see an action will have a certain effect, and you can choose to do otherwise, and you choose that course of action, you're responsible for the consequences. So if a gene or a combination of genes or some state of biology will only slightly increase the chance of some valuable outcome, if we choose not to realise that outcome, we're responsible. And that is irrational. So even a very weak expectation can be a rational ground for action in the absence of some other good reason. So we heard yesterday this scepticism that genes or biology has much effect. At one point, I think it was said that, I'll pass over. Even if the effect of genes in biology is not as great as I've attempted to indicate, even if it's very small, we still have a rational ground to select or enhance. Here's the analogy. Imagine I offer you X or Y. And X or Y is an amount of money between $0 and $100,000, plucked at random from a barrel, from a container. And you don't know how much money you're going to get. You don't know what X or Y is. And you can choose X or Y. But if you choose X, in addition to getting the amount of money that you get from the barrel, you get a 1 in 6 chance. We throw a dice, one of those little cubes. And if it comes up number 6, you get an extra $100. But what should you choose, X or Y? It's a feature of rationality. You should choose X. Even though you expect to get a lot of money from this barrel, because there's an amount of money up to $100,000, you've got an extra chance of getting a bit more money. And if money is valuable to you, you have the force of reason to choose X, even though the effect is very small. Because there's no other, if you don't like money, or you don't like dice, that would be a reason not to choose X. Or if you've been a gambler and you have some phobia of dice, these would be reasons not to choose X. But absent some reason, you have a reason to select the best. So we heard this objection, which I've heard many times, to arguments for enhancement or genetic selection, that the embryo that you discard, even though you expect one to be slightly better than another, could have been Mozart, could have been Beethoven. But here you have to make your decision with limited information. If you have an embryo with Tourette's syndrome, it's just as likely to be a genius based on the information which you have as one without Tourette's syndrome. And Tourette's syndrome is bad in itself. So unless there is some evidence for a link between Tourette's syndrome and genius, you're rationally required to choose to have an embryo without Tourette's syndrome. This is irrational. It's irrational not to select. If you have evidence that some property is associated with a better life or a worse life, that's what the wheel of fortune analogy is meant to show you. So here are some more arguments for why we should reject the arguments of Fukuyama and Habermas that we should enhance or select our children. Firstly, imagine this scenario. Imagine I have a child who is born with some talent. Let's assume it's a very high IQ, an IQ of say 160. Or you could great musical talent, the talent of Mozart. Let's take the Mozart, because everyone gets excited by Mozart now. Let's say you have a child born with the musical talent of Mozart. But this child has a very small change in its biology. And unless you give the child a vitamin B every day, the child's musical talent will go to normal, go back to normal, like all of us. Now, if the parents fail to give this vitamin every day, I think they act wrongly. They fail to preserve something which is very valuable. Now, they might have a very good reason, like the vitamin is very expensive, or the vitamin is very difficult to obtain, or they have to save the life of another child. These are good reasons, which may outweigh the reason they have to provide the vitamin. But absent such a reason, it would be wrong to fail to give this baby Mozart the vitamin B that he needs to maintain his musical genius. But now imagine you have a child who's born who's completely normal like all of us. And this child too has a change in the metabolism. So that if you gave the child vitamin B, the child would acquire musical genius equivalent to that of Mozart. In this case, if you fail to give the vitamin, exactly the same situation occurs. The child who could have been a musical genius is not. If it's wrong in the first case, it's equally wrong in the second case. If you think that musical genius is something valuable. If you don't, then there's no issue. But if you take something that you think is valuable, or the ability to understand other people's emotions, or intelligence. Now, if you substitute vitamin for genetic intervention, the only difference could be that the genetic intervention might be more expensive, more unsafe, or be passed on to the next generation. And neither of those things necessarily, unless they're significant, provide a good reason to not give the vitamin. So as I said, once we can avoid doing something, we're responsible for the consequences, if we can foresee it. So when we couldn't affect the nature of our children, we were not responsible for their deficiencies and disabilities. But now we choose to ignore available technology, to ignore enhancement, to ignore genetic selection. We are responsible for the consequences. The second argument is that we accept environmental intervention our children. We are all in favour of better education and better diet. We train our children to be well-behaved, cooperative, intelligent, emotionally responsive. We accept some kinds of drugs. And in the case of selection, couples often wait to have a different child at a later point in time when they have more financial and other resources to give that child a better life. Now, environmental changes do not act mysteriously. They change biology. When you form a memory, you change the structure of your brain. Very subtle ways, but you change the structure of your brain. These changes can be passed on to the next generation. So when you deprive rats of motherly love, the rat's brain does not develop normally. So when you change the environment, you change the brain structure. And that change is passed on to the children of that rat, who changes in the regulation of the genes. So if we accept the change of biology by environmental means, like education, like the use of diet, why not accept the same changes through our knowledge of biology? My last argument that for why we should embrace both enhancement and the genetic selection of our children is that we are all in favour of the treatment and prevention of disease, and most people are in favour of selecting children who are not susceptible to diseases. But health is not what is called an intrinsic good, and disease is not an intrinsic bad. These are not bad in themselves. A disease which didn't affect your well-being would be irrelevant. Health is good because it enables you to be happy, to do what you want with your life, to engage with your family, to work, to achieve what you want, to engage in your hobbies. These are what are most valuable in life. These are what are intrinsically valuable. These are the components of well-being. So what drives the moral imperative to treat and prevent disease is the magnitude of the effect of disease on our well-being. But I've tried to argue that our well-being is not just constituted by or influenced by whether we have a disease or not, it's also influenced by our nature. So if well-being is what is important, we have a reason to change our biology insofar as our biology affects our well-being. Okay, so many people will be, first of all, sceptical that we can talk about human well-being in terms that could give us reasons to change our biology. Philosophers have debated the concept of well-being for over 2,000 years. There are various theories of well-being. Hedonistic theories say that well-being is leading a happy life. Desire fulfillment theories say that your life goes well when your desires are satisfied. And objective theories say there are objective ways of being which are good for humans, such as developing your talents, gaining knowledge, relating to other human beings. On all of these, it's not just the absence of disease. People trade their length of life for non-health related well-being when they smoke, drink alcohol, or engage in risky activities. But we are not completely ignorant of what might be a good life, because our social institutions and our educational systems all are driven by a concept of the good life. We ask people's advice, we try to help ourselves to have better lives, and we educate our children. The model of well-being that we use for these is a model that most people share. And it's clear that this well-being is determined not just by genes or by environment, but by both. Okay, let me give you an example of a property of our nature that will affect how our lives go. And then I'll finish up in 5 minutes or so. It's a feature of the kind of account of disabilities as being a state of biology or psychology that reduces well-being. But the disabilities are in fact not just external things like blindness or deafness, but inherent features in all of our biology that affect our lives. And they're dependent on social and environmental context. But what's important is that we can predict what the likely social and environmental context is, and predict which states of our biology will be disabilities. And here's one disability: poor self-control. In the 1960s, Walter Mischel conducted a famous set of experiments with 4-year-old children, where he placed a marshmallow, I don't know if you know what this is, it's a sweet, a lolly, a sweet, in front of 4-year-old children. And he said, "Here is a marshmallow. If you don't eat that marshmallow when I leave the room, when I come back, I'll give you 2. And he left the room. And he came back. And some children eat the marshmallow, and some children haven't. Not a very surprising experiment. But what was surprising is when he followed these children up 10 years later. And those who resisted the marshmallow, who controlled their impulses, who devised strategies of self-control, who were able to delay the gratification of eating a marshmallow now, those children 10 years later had more friends, were better academic performance, and were more motivated to succeed. And this feature was more highly correlated with their SAT scores than their IQ was. And very poor impulse control is very highly correlated with imprisonment and very low position on a socioeconomic scale. Poor self-control, even within the normal range, is a disability. If we could change this through our knowledge of biology, I think we should change it. If we could select amongst 10 embryos, those embryos which were destined to have poor self-control and those which were destined to have good self-control, you've got a rational reason, you've got a reason based on this evidence to select the ones which have got good self-control. That's what it is to be a human being, it's to make rational choices. Choose the good rather than the bad. Now, there are other all-purpose goods like self-control that help you to lead whatever life you want, like intelligence, memory, self-discipline, foresight. The genetic and biological bases of these and the differences between us give us reasons to enhance or select these valuable properties. Even if you think, as Kant thought, that autonomy was the supreme feature of the human condition, you can enhance people's autonomy. Because autonomy requires the concept of self, the ability to remember, strength of will, foresight, empathy, etc. And insofar as our biology affects these, we should enhance them as far as we can. Religiosity has a significant genetic component. Criminality, again, one mutation when coupled with social deprivation has been highly correlated with criminality, and so on. We have reasons to select embryos which don't have these changes based on the information we have, and reasons to enhance people who do have these. Pass over these. So what I've argued is that what matters is human well-being, not just the treatment and prevention of disease. Our biology does affect our opportunities to live well. Our biology affects how we experience stimuli. It's the essence of humanity to choose to be better. It's the essence of humans to be rational, to make rational choices. The biological route is no different to the environmental. Biological manipulation to increase opportunity and reduce disabilities is not just right, but morally required. Now, there are a number of responses to this kind of argument, and I won't give them all. I'll let you give them. Let me just give you the Gallagher objection. Now, many people fear that this will result in a two-tiered society of the enhanced and the unenhanced, the genetically elite and the genetically inferior, where the inferior are discriminated against and disadvantaged all through life. And this was what you saw yesterday in the film Gallagher. My complaint about Gallagher was not the genetic determinism that Professor Penner was so concerned about. I think it is overly genetically deterministic, but it's a film, it's a fantasy. What I'm concerned about is every time I talk about enhancement or selection, people say, but what about Gallagher? And it's true that one possible future world is a world like Gattaca, where people are discriminated against on the basis of their genes, where those with so-called inferior genomes are disadvantaged significantly. But it's also important to remember that nature is not some Marxist or some egalitarian or some god that dishes out genes with an idea of fairness. It has no mind to fairness. Some people are born horribly disadvantaged, not just with diseases, but with genes that will mean that they are unable to participate in a technologically advanced life. There's nothing fair about the natural lottery. Now, when we couldn't affect the natural lottery, we weren't responsible for its results, but now we can affect the natural lottery. And if we choose to allow inequality to occur, which will naturally occur, and profound inequality, we're responsible for that inequality. So the film Gattaca is a pretty bad example, but there's a lot of places in the world today that are a lot worse than Gattaca. So allowing enhancement can be used to reduce natural inequality. So how well the lives of people who are disadvantaged go depends not on whether enhancement is permitted, depends on the social institutions. What was wrong with Gattaca was not that people were genetically selected, it's that you had no opportunity, in virtue of the social institutions that were in place in such a society, to have an opportunity of a good life. And Gattaca actually, the problem with Gattaca is not the genetic determinism, it's the social determinism. It's the idea that because we enhance people, we will inevitably be led to a society like Gattaca, where people will be subjugated. One will be subjugated to another. But that's our choice. We can have a world where everyone has a fair go, a decent chance of a decent life. Indeed, whether people have disease and disability, people will always become disadvantaged through accidents and injury. And we have egalitarian social institutions of law against discrimination that are designed to make sure that everyone, regardless of their natural inequality, has a decent chance of a decent life. What's wrong with Gattaca is not the genetic determinism, but the social determinism. And the idea that we have no control over our technology at Gattaca makes Gattaca a bad film for me. So how the biologically modified and unmodified are treated as a part of our choice, just as having races or sexes are treated as a part of our choice. And equal concern and respect is possible in the world of biological manipulation. Okay, let me finish up here. So, George Bernard Shaw said, "The reasonable man adapts himself to the world. The unreasonable one persists in trying to adapt the world to himself. Therefore, all progress depends on the unreasonable man." Sure, it's wrong. Sometimes it's rational to adapt biologically or psychologically to the world. Sometimes it's rational to change the world. Sometimes we should accept things as they are. Which course of action we choose depends on the benefits and risks. It depends on a rational choice. I haven't argued that we should always intervene in our biology to change the human condition. I haven't argued that we should give priority to the biological. I've argued that the biological can influence the human condition and that we should consider in each circumstance our reasons for and against whether we choose an intervention. In some cases we'll have more reason to choose social interventions or environmental interventions. But in some cases biological interventions may be the best solution. Just to give a trivial example, exposure to the sun and the risk of skin cancer. We can reduce the risk of skin cancer by giving people cream, clothes, external shade, or we can change the amount of melanin, the black pigment in the skin, to make people darker and more resistant to the sun. Which one you choose depends on the circumstances and the risks and benefits. So I haven't argued that in every circumstance we must enhance people or we must select the best child. I've argued that we have a good reason to. And which course of action we choose will of course depend on the options and the risks and benefits of all the options. But our prima facie position should be one that there are good reasons to enhance ourselves and to select the best children. And we have to have a good reason not to do that, rather than the other way around. So I'll finish there and Thank you.